Imagine living in a world where your father could legally kill you for what you did behind closed doors, where even a rumor about your private life could erase your name from public records. A world where intimacy wasn't just personal, it was law, power, and survival. That wasn't fiction. That was Rome. Most people think they know Roman history. Gladiators, emperors, togas, war. But beneath the grand temples and marble statues, the Roman Empire operated on a dark system of control, a system that reached into bedrooms, minds, and bodies. For more than 500 years, Rome wasn't just a superpower. It was a machine built to dominate every form of human connection. They didn't just conquer nations. They conquered the idea of privacy. In Rome, your value as a person could be determined by a whisper about what role you played in bed. Sound dramatic? It was law. You see, the Roman elite believed that power wasn't just military or political. It was physical. Dominance meant strength. Submission meant shame. And that wasn't a cultural attitude. It was a legal structure. If you were seen as passive in any intimate act, even in your own home, it wasn't just embarrassing. It could destroy your entire life. Take Julius Caesar, a man who crossed the Rubicon, conquered Gaul, and transformed Rome into an empire. But even Caesar couldn't escape one scandal from his youth. When he was 19, he visited King Nicomedes of Bithynia. What happened there is still debated, but one thing's clear. The Roman elite believed Caesar took the passive role. That rumor followed him for the rest of his life. For decades, senators mocked him as the Queen of Bithynia. Soldiers sang jokes about him during his triumph parades. Even poets wrote about his supposed submission, and Romans recited those verses at parties. You could rule half the known world, but if you were seen as weak in bed, you'd never escape the shame. And that wasn't just gossip. Rome passed a law called the Lex Scantinia. It made passive behavior by freeborn men a crime. Not just frowned upon, an actual punishable crime. The punishment? Fines, exile, even death. The law didn't require proof. Just an accusation. Just a whisper. There are recorded cases where men were expelled from the Senate, not for treason or bribery, but because a servant claimed they were submissive during sex with their own wife. Let that sink in. A married man could lose everything because someone thought he wasn't dominant enough with his own spouse. Once labeled impure, you became a ghost. You couldn't share food with others. Parents wouldn't let their kids near you. No one would speak your name in public. It was worse than murder, because it was a permanent stain. And the system was perfectly organized. At the top was the emperor. He could dominate anyone. Below him, senators could dominate citizens, but not other senators. Citizens could dominate freedmen, but not other citizens. Freedmen could only dominate slaves. Slaves? They were at the bottom. They couldn't dominate anyone. Even trying could get them executed. Break that chain. You broke the law. There's a chilling example. A wealthy citizen named Lucius was caught in a submissive position with his own slave. You might think, he owned the slave, what's the problem? But in Roman law, it didn't matter. Lucius lost his citizenship. His property was seized. His children were cut off from inheritance. His wife was legally forced to divorce him. And finally, he was exiled forever, all because of his position. Rome even had vocabulary for this. Legal terms, not insults. Labels that decided your status, your rights, even who you could marry. You were either a dominator or a disgrace. Fathers warned their sons in letters, never speak too softly, never walk too gently. Never look uncertain. Even your voice could betray you. So why did Romans build an entire system around this? Because they saw the world through conquest. Their armies didn't just win wars, they set the example. To be Roman was to conquer. To be conquered was to be weak. In their minds, being submissive, even in love, was the same as losing a war. It was being feminized compared to a slave. And no Roman man wanted that. Even business deals and religious rituals were described in terms of dominance. Who's on top? Who takes control? Who yields? Intimacy wasn't connection. It was warfare, a place to prove your rank. It worked. The fear of being labeled submissive made Roman citizens police themselves. Men lived in paranoia, constantly watching their own behavior, terrified that one wrong gesture could ruin everything. It was a genius system, brutal but effective. The empire didn't need to spy on everyone. They made people spy on themselves. In Rome, every bed was a battlefield. Every whisper could end a legacy. And every private act had the power to kill. And if that sounds insane, we haven't even started talking about what happened to women. If Roman men lived under pressure to dominate, Roman women lived under a kind of silent torture, a performance of numbness, a ritual of self-erasure. Because in Rome, if you were a woman, showing pleasure wasn't just discouraged. It was criminal. Let's be clear. We're not talking about scandalous affairs or indecency in public. We're talking about what happened in your own bed, with your own husband. If you showed signs of enjoyment, if you moved, gasped, made a sound, or even seemed too engaged, you could be accused of adultery. And the punishment? Death. This wasn't rare. It was institutional. Augustus, the emperor who loved to present himself as a moral reformer, passed laws that literally outlawed female sexual agency. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis didn't just target extramarital affairs, it criminalized a woman's body. Under this law, a father had legal power to kill his daughter and her lover on the spot. No trial, no appeal, just execution for dishonoring the family. Even the emperor's own daughter wasn't safe. Julia the Elder, daughter of Augustus, was exiled to a remote island. Why? Because rumors claimed she was too enthusiastic at private parties. Not caught in the act, just accused of enjoying herself. Her father, the moral guardian of Rome, forbade anyone from visiting her, banned her from drinking wine, and denied her a burial in the family tomb. He erased her for being human. But Rome didn't stop at laws. They backed it up with medicine, superstition, and religion. Roman doctors, the most educated men of the empire, created elaborate theories to pathologize female pleasure. They warned that arousal in women could lead to hysteria, demonic possession, or a condition called wandering womb, where the uterus would detach and float through the body like a ghost. The solution? Suppress all signs of enjoyment. How? Through torture. Women suspected of desiring too much were treated with brutal methods. Ice baths to shock the body. Lead and mercury potions to numb the nerves. Inhalation of toxic smoke to calm the womb. These weren't rare treatments, they were standard, and they were used on wives, daughters, and noblewomen alike. Consider the case of Sronia, a noblewoman whose story survives in fragments. After her husband claimed she enjoyed their wedding night too visibly, she was sent to physicians for correction. Her treatment included daily immersion in ice water, herbal poisons that caused vomiting and weakness, bloodletting to reduce her vitality, and a powder made from lead to cool her passion. After 6 months of this, she'd learned how to lie completely still. The doctors pronounced her cured. This was the Roman solution to female sexuality. Freeze it, poison it, silence it. Meanwhile, Roman men celebrated their own appetites. They could visit brothels, engage with slaves, boast of their prowess in the Senate, even build monuments to their exploits. But if their wife smiled during sex, that was evidence of infidelity. The double standard wasn't just cruel, it was deliberate. Women were taught that numbness was survival. Girls learned early how to suppress every sign of enjoyment. There are records of mothers writing to daughters with advice like, "Bite your lip if you feel it rising. Think of accounting. Count ceiling tiles." Generations of Roman women were trained to disassociate from their own bodies, to turn off their minds during intimacy, to fake silence, to survive. And it wasn't just about individual control. Rome treated women's bodies as public property. A daughter's virtue belonged to her father. A wife's pleasure, or lack of it, belonged to her husband. Consent was never even part of the conversation. Personal desire was irrelevant. Intimacy belonged to men. A woman's body was real estate to be governed, not lived in. The legal term was stupum. It didn't mean cheating. It meant violating male ownership, no matter how the woman felt. There's a chilling case of a woman named Claudia. She was accused of adultery, not because anyone saw her with a lover, but because witnesses said she laughed too loudly with a male friend in the marketplace. She smiled. She flushed. Her husband divorced her. Her father disowned her. She lost her children. All because she showed too much happiness in public. Religion made it worse. Priests warned that female pleasure angered the gods. Earthquakes, crop failures, military defeats, all blamed on women who enjoyed themselves too much. Even Rome's most sacred priestesses, the Vestal Virgins, were expected to feel nothing, want nothing, desire nothing. Why? Why this level of terror? Because Rome feared what it couldn't dominate. You could conquer lands, enslave men, control money. But a woman's pleasure? That required her participation, her choice, her yes. And in a society built on conquest, choice was a threat. So Rome buried it, literally. They created a civilization where women were safer dead than desiring, where silence was protection, where numbness was virtue, and where the worst sin a woman could commit was feeling alive. And yet, the horror goes deeper, because if women were punished for feeling, the Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred girls, were punished simply for being touched. And when they were found guilty, they weren't executed. They were buried alive. Imagine being chosen at 6 years old to serve the gods. You're taken from your family, given a home in the sacred heart of the city, dressed in white robes, and told your body now belongs to the divine. You're praised, honored, feared. You can own property. You can write a will. You can walk through the streets of Rome without a man to escort you. But there's one condition. You must remain a virgin for 30 years, not 30 months, not until marriage. 30 years of absolute purity, no touch, no desire, not even a thought. And if you fail, you die, but not by sword or fire, not by poison or hanging. You're buried alive, sealed beneath the earth, while the city above pretends you never existed. This wasn't a punishment reserved for criminals. This was the fate of Rome's most sacred priestesses, the Vestal Virgins. To the outside world, they were Rome's spiritual elite, guardians of the sacred flame that protected the empire. As long as that flame burned, Rome endured, and as long as the Vestals remained pure, the gods were satisfied. But one moment of human weakness, one kiss, one glance, one rumor, could result in a living death. Here's how it worked. When a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, She wasn't simply found guilty. She was ceremonially unmade. Her sacred robes were stripped. She was dressed like a bride, because her death was framed as a marriage to the underworld. Bound in silence, she was placed in a closed litter and carried through the streets. The people of Rome, forced to watch in silence, lined the roads. Speaking was forbidden. Looking away was punishable. At the burial site, a tiny underground chamber waited, just large enough for a bed, a lamp, some bread and water. Not enough to survive, just enough to say she wasn't technically being executed. The Vestal had to descend the ladder herself. No one could push her. She had to step into her own grave willingly. Once she was inside, the earth was poured over the entrance, smoothed flat, as if nothing had ever been there. Above ground, life continued. Below, she suffocated in darkness. Let that settle in. Rome murdered its sacred women with such ceremony, they turned execution into a religious ritual. And it wasn't rare. It was political. Emperor Domitian once condemned a Vestal named Cornelia after 20 years of service. No evidence was presented. Rome had suffered military defeats, and the emperor needed someone to blame. As they led her away, she cried out, "How can Caesar call me impure when he triumphed under my watch?" It didn't matter. She was buried alive to appease the gods, or more accurately, the empire's paranoia. And the men involved? Any man caught with a Vestal faced a punishment even worse. He was beaten to death with rods in the Forum, Rome's central square, publicly, brutally, until his body was unrecognizable. The process could take hours. This wasn't justice. It was theater. And how did they even know a Vestal had broken her vow? Through sacred examinations. Priests believed they could detect lost purity by looking at skin color, body weight, even eye brightness. If a Vestal seemed too thin, maybe she was lovesick. Too pale, perhaps guilty. Too flushed, obviously hiding passion. They watched everything. Every bite of food. Every word. Every facial expression. Slaves spied. Priests interrogated. Political rivals spread rumors. No proof was needed. Just suspicion. Imagine living like that for 30 years. Some couldn't take it. There are fragments of letters written by Vestals describing nightmares, hallucinations, self-harm. One wrote, "I dream the earth opens beneath me. I wake gasping for breath that isn't there." Another compulsively checked her body for signs of guilt. Skin too warm, heart beating too fast. And those who survived. They left service at age 36 or 40, past their childbearing years by Roman standards. They had no families, no husbands, no children. They were treated as half-human, sacred, but broken. Some lived as social outcasts. Others simply disappeared from history. This system wasn't about protecting faith. It was about control. Rome took little girls, dressed them in divinity, and sentenced them to 30 years of silent trauma. The flame they tended symbolized Rome's survival, but in reality, it was the empire's ability to police innocence, punish emotion, and bury desire. The Vestal institution lasted over 1,000 years. 1,000 years of girls being buried alive because they experienced what every human is born to feel. 1,000 years of breathless deaths beneath the stones of the Capitol. Rome made virginity into a cult. They weaponized purity, and they called it divine. But what happened in the emperor's palace makes even this look merciful. Because while Rome was killing girls for being touched, the emperors were building entire systems to abuse children in plain sight, protected by law, justified by religion, and celebrated as power. What the emperors did behind closed doors wasn't just indulgence. It was institutionalized horror. And it was only getting started. While the sacred daughters of Rome were being buried alive for the crime of being touched, something far more disturbing was happening behind the palace doors. Because if Rome punished purity with death, it rewarded perversion with a crown. The emperor wasn't bound by the rules he enforced on others. He rewrote them. And what he did with that power makes every modern scandal look like child's play. To understand what happened in the imperial bedroom, you have to first understand this. Roman emperors didn't just abuse power, they turned it into entertainment. They didn't hide their sickness. They institutionalized it. They built palaces around it. They passed laws to protect it. And they called it godhood. Emperor Tiberius, the man who followed Augustus, withdrew from Rome and built his personal kingdom of horror on the island of Capri. There, away from public scrutiny, he constructed pleasure palaces filled with pools, fountains, and hidden chambers. But these weren't ordinary retreats. These were facilities designed for the grooming and abuse of children. He called them his little fish. Children trained from infancy to serve him while he bathed. Infants raised not with love, but with discipline, fear, and reward systems. They were taught to swim between his legs, to perform, to obey. The ones who cried, drowned. The ones who complied, rewarded with food and survival. There were no parents, no comfort, just systematic conditioning to break them down into obedient tools of imperial satisfaction. And it wasn't just a handful. Tiberius had an entire staff dedicated to procurement, scouts who traveled across the empire, searching for boys at the exact developmental stage he preferred. Not too young to be useless, not too old to fight back. If a family resisted giving up their child, the response was brutal. Execution, crucifixion. Entire bloodlines wiped out to hide the crime of saying no to the emperor. What he created was a factory. Dormitories full of children. Trainers to teach compliance. Doctors to drug them into submission. And accountants to record every expense, labeled under theatrical supplies. But Tiberius was just the beginning. Caligula, his successor, elevated depravity into public ritual. He didn't just abuse family members, he celebrated it. He openly took his sisters to bed during public banquets. Senators were required to attend, to watch, to applaud, and if anyone looked away, they were accused of treason. When his favorite sister Drusilla died, Caligula declared her a goddess. But worship wasn't optional. Every Roman citizen was commanded to honor her as divine. Refusing meant death, not because of blasphemy, but because the emperor's lust had become law. He invited noblemen and their wives to dinner, examined the women like livestock, then chose one to take into his chambers. The husband would wait at the table, sipping wine, while Caligula used his wife. Then he would return, describe every detail, critique her technique, publicly, with laughter, and everyone clapped, because they were afraid not to. But the horror didn't stop with women. Caligula auctioned off virginities like market goods. When one senator's wife refused him, he stripped her naked at a party and sold her to the highest bidder, right in front of her husband. And then came Nero. If Tiberius built the system, and Caligula weaponized it, Nero turned it into performance art. He didn't just abuse a boy named Sporus, he castrated him, married him, dressed him as an empress, held a wedding with guests, vows, and a public feast. The people were told to cheer, or be executed for disloyalty. That wasn't the worst of it. Nero invented what he called beast games. In full arenas, with thousands watching, he dressed in animal skins was released from a cage, and attacked bound men and women tied to stakes. He bit them, clawed them, simulated violence, not in secret, but as state entertainment. People came with their children. They sold snacks. They placed bets. If you didn't cheer, you were suspected of sedition. His palace, the Golden House, had rotating bedrooms with ceilings that opened to shower guests with petals and perfume during orgies. There were hidden passages for spying, mechanical beds for performances, rooms painted with stars so he could pretend he was violating gods. There were roles in the court specifically created for these activities, paid positions, with titles, training, salaries, performance reviews. You weren't a victim. You were imperial staff. Parents offered their children to the palace to gain favor. Fathers castrated their sons to make them more appealing. Mothers taught their daughters how to serve the emperor's tastes. To be noticed by the court wasn't fear. It was ambition. The machinery was too vast to stop. Even when a good emperor like Marcus Aurelius tried to shut it down, he barely scratched the surface. He closed a few facilities, executed a few procurers, freed some victims, but the system simply went underground. When his son Commodus came to power, he brought it all back. Bigger, louder, crueler. The imperial court wasn't a palace. It was a predator factory. And what makes it worse? This wasn't hidden. This wasn't scandal. This was normal. State-funded. Publicly celebrated. Carved into stone. Protected by law. Defended by priests. Praised by poets. And paid for by Roman taxpayers. While women were executed for smiling, emperors were worshipped for crimes so disturbing they're hard to describe. That's the true horror of Roman power. Not just that it corrupted, but that it convinced everyone else to cheer while it did. And if that sounds like the worst of it, you haven't seen how Rome turned intimacy itself into a public bloodsport. Because what came next wasn't law. It wasn't religion. It wasn't politics. It was competition, and people died trying to win. You think modern culture is obsessed with performance? Likes, scores, trophies, leaderboards? Rome did it first. And they didn't stop at politics or warfare. They gamified intimacy. They turned human connection into a competition, and people literally died trying to win. Rome didn't hide its appetites. It celebrated them in colosseums, villas, and public baths. But more disturbing than the acts themselves was the structure behind it. This wasn't hedonism. It was administration, with rules, judges, sponsors, medical staff, and betting houses. Imagine if a sex marathon was announced like an Olympic event. Posters across the city, patrons sponsoring the contestants, families buying tickets, spectators gathering at sundown, snacks in hand, ready to cheer for the most athletically gifted man or woman. This wasn't hidden. This was mainstream, and it was deadly. One of the most infamous competitions in Roman history involved Empress Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. According to ancient sources, including Pliny the Elder, she entered into a one-night endurance contest with Rome's most famous courtesan. The goal: see who could sleep with more men before sunrise. The courtesan, a professional, had strategies. She paced herself, used recovery techniques, hydrated. She quit at 23 partners. Exhausted but satisfied. Messalina, she was just warming up. She kept going. 25. Then 30. The competition had to be forcibly ended, not because she was tired, but because she demanded more opponents. Her attendants had to drag her away. And this wasn't some hidden scandal. The court recorded it. Rome discussed it like a military victory. She had made history. That was Rome. A society that ranked intimacy like athletics. That tracked stats like modern sports analysts. Duration, partner count, technique, stamina, audience response. Points were awarded. Champions were crowned. Monuments were carved. These weren't rumors. They were official records. But this was just one example. Gladiator schools, the very institutions that trained Rome's deadliest fighters, also trained their bodies for sex competitions. The same discipline that produced sword masters produced bedroom athletes. Stamina, pain tolerance, agility. They weren't just used in combat. They were used in contests of pleasure and endurance. Gladiators who won in the arena were auctioned for private sessions with wealthy patrons. Sometimes the reward wasn't freedom through battle. It was freedom through performance. If you impressed the right aristocrat, you could buy your release. With your body. And there were rules. Lots of them. Competitions were judged by panels. Often older men past their prime, assigned to rate everything from duration to creativity. There were scoring rubrics. Points for technique, poise, partner response. Deductions for failure to maintain arousal. Bonus points for stamina. Audience votes for crowd favorites. Women competed too, but often with horrifying stakes. Many weren't volunteers. They were slaves or desperate freedwomen, forced to participate for survival. Some could earn freedom or money. Most walked away injured, ill, or worse. Medical records from the time describe ruptures, infections, chronic bleeding. Physicians weren't there to protect contestants. They were there to keep them functional, to patch them up so they could continue. The shows had to go on, and Rome turned this into an industry. Training academies taught techniques, breathing, recovery, pain management. Merchants sold performance-enhancing potions, many of which were toxic. Crushed beetles to increase blood flow. Mercury-based mixtures to prolong sensation. Lead, opium, alcohol. The side effects were brutal. Organ damage, hallucinations. Death mid-competition wasn't rare. It was expected, and when it happened, the crowd cheered. Promoters marketed events like modern fight nights. Tonight, Marcus the Mighty versus Gaius the Enduring, sunset to sunrise. Bathhouses turned into arenas. Patrons bought tickets. Children sat in balconies. Vendors sold roasted nuts and honeyed wine, while adults destroyed their bodies for applause. And they documented everything. Stone tablets recorded world records. The longest session. The most partners. The most positions performed in one event. People made pilgrimages to view these carved achievements like tourists visiting the Colosseum. Rich elites hosted their own contests in private villas. Themed events. Greek-style Olympic orgies. Egyptian-inspired positions. Exotic guests. Customized scoring. Trophies shaped like golden phalluses. Wall paintings commemorating victories. Poets wrote verses. Sculptors made statues. Winners became celebrities. This was Rome's reality. Not a fringe subculture. Not some secret fetish. It was normalized. Professional. Brutal. Children were raised with this. They watched. They learned. They internalized. Boys were taught that sexual domination meant power. Girls learned their bodies were arenas. Schools didn't teach respect. They taught roles: master and submissive, victor and loser. It created a generation that saw intimacy not as connection, but as conquest. And the worst part, the government taxed it. Winnings were reported. Prizes were regulated. Betting was monitored. Even the emperor's office took a share. Sex wasn't personal. It was profitable. Rome built roads, aqueducts, and legal codes that still influence us today. But it also built an economy on weaponized pleasure and industrialized pain. The same engineers who built bridges also designed performance beds. The same artists who painted gods also painted competitions. And the culture it left behind still echoes in the modern world, in our obsession with performance, with records, with showing off rather than connecting. But if you think that's the end, you haven't seen the people who taught Romans how to do it. Because behind the scenes of every noble wedding, every private session, every competition, were trained performers who demonstrated it all, in front of live audiences. They were called spintri, and they weren't actors. They were living manuals, bodies broken in training to teach others how to perform. In a society where intimacy was a competition, performance wasn't just expected, it was taught. And the teaching didn't happen with diagrams or books. It happened with bodies. Breathing, bending, breaking bodies. Rome created a class of people whose only job was to demonstrate how to please, dominate, and survive in bed. They were called spintri, and they were the most trained, tortured, and terrifying educators the world has ever known. You didn't meet spintrii in brothels. You met them in noble homes, before a wedding, during private dinners, at political retreats. They were performers, yes, but also instructors, experts in techniques, timing, and tolerances. They arrived with their equipment, their assistants, and their contracts, because what they demonstrated wasn't just spectacle, it was considered essential education. And they weren't acting. Spintrii performed live, in front of guests, often in front of children. Noble daughters, on the night before their arranged marriages, would be sat down in a quiet room, not for a lecture, not for a blessing, but to watch two human beings, often strangers, show them, step by step, what they were expected to do the following night. How to move, when to breathe, where to place weight, what sounds to make, and more importantly, what sounds not to make. These weren't brief performances. Some lasted hours. Guests were expected to observe carefully. Some even took notes. And this wasn't limited to brides. Spintrii were also hired to train household slaves, those expected to entertain visiting guests. These sessions were less like rehearsals and more like military drills. Slaves lined up, watched the demonstrations, then practiced under supervision. Mistakes were punished. Failure meant being sold off, or worse. But where did spintrii come from? How were they trained? That's where it gets horrifying. They were selected as children. Scouts looked for extreme flexibility, abnormal stamina, double-jointed limbs. If a child could bend in unnatural ways, if they had high pain tolerance, if they didn't cry easily, they were marked, taken, bought, stolen, enrolled in training academies that functioned more like torture camps than schools. These children didn't play. They didn't learn to read. They were forced to master positions and sequences that most adult bodies could never attempt. They were trained to hold contortions that restricted breathing, to perform acts that caused joint damage, to keep smiling even when their ribs cracked. Half of them died in training. Yes, half. Internal bleeding, torn muscles, brain damage from repeated oxygen loss, infections from tissue rupture. But those who survived were considered perfect demonstration tools. They weren't treated as people. They were seen as walking instruction manuals. Standard training groups included 3 spintrii, 2 performers and 1 narrator. The narrator described each movement in detail as the others acted it out. It was like an anatomical lesson, but with real people showing real acts in real time. In some elite homes, the narrator was a child too, because even the explanation had to seem innocent. Some demonstrations used props, custom furniture, restraint systems, mirrors positioned for maximum visibility, measurements drawn on the floor. Everything was calculated. It was engineering, biology, theater, pornography, all at once. And the audience, often entire families. Fathers sat with sons, mothers with daughters. Roman culture believed early exposure prevented shame, so they started young. Boys were shown how to dominate. Girls were shown how to submit. One spintrii recalled performing for a bride barely 13 years old. The girl fainted halfway through. No one stopped the show. But spintrii weren't just for education. They were also used for entertainment. Imperial parties often featured live demonstrations. The best spintrii became celebrities. They had names known across the empire. They were invited to perform at elite events, not just to teach, but to impress. There was Marcus the Flexible, who could dislocate his own hips to achieve impossible positions. Livia the Enduring, who once performed for 12 hours straight without collapsing. Gaius the Innovator, who invented 17 new positions, some of which were etched into stone as official Roman techniques. But fame didn't equal freedom. By the age of 30, most spintrii were physically destroyed. Years of extreme performance left them with chronic pain, bone deformities, and psychological trauma. There was no retirement fund, no pension, no dignity. Many ended up homeless, begging on the streets with bodies that could no longer function. Some couldn't stop performing, even when they were alone. They had been trained so completely, so deeply, that their sense of identity vanished without an audience. They described feeling unreal unless they were being watched. And their influence, it seeped into every part of Roman life. Their techniques became the standard. Their performances set expectations. Every nobleman, every politician, every merchant knew the right way to behave in bed because a spintrii had shown them. Intimacy became formula, a routine, a checklist. Not connection, not pleasure, execution. Spintrii didn't just teach Roman citizens how to perform. They taught them how to feel nothing while performing everything. They trained a culture to see intimacy not as a moment of trust, but as a display of dominance, a ritual of control. And that is perhaps their most horrifying legacy. Because when a civilization turns people into tools, into props for pleasure and power, it doesn't just destroy the performers. It destroys the audience too. But the madness didn't stop there. Because while spintrii were demonstrating in bedrooms, outside, in the streets of Rome, another message was being carved into stone. Every corner, every fountain, every street sign, not with words, but with symbols. And they all pointed in one direction: total normalization of the obscene. Step outside in ancient Rome, and the streets didn't look like history books show them. They weren't filled with marble silence or grand philosophical debate. They were loud, busy, filthy, and unmistakably obsessed with one thing: the phallus. Not in secret, not hidden, carved into stone, painted onto walls, baked into bread, hanging in doorways. Imagine if every street sign was a penis. Every bakery, every bathhouse, every street corner marked with thick stone arrows, realistic, detailed, often enormous, all pointing the way. But they weren't just decorations. They were directions. Follow the symbol, and it would lead you to Rome's entertainment district. Brothels, bathhouses, and private dens. The bigger the carving, the more elite the services. Some had price lists. Others included specialty icons. It was GPS, carved in genitals. Pompeii alone, preserved in ash, revealed over 40 phallic markers carved into streets. Not one or two. Dozens. At child height. Smoothed down by centuries of hands touching them for luck. They weren't considered obscene. They were considered sacred. Children played hopscotch around them. Families picnicked beneath towering statues. And no one batted an eye. Because in Rome, the phallus wasn't dirty. It was divine. The god Priapus, half man, half monster, always erect, stood guard in gardens, homes, and marketplaces. He wasn't subtle. Statues of him were massive, sometimes taller than a man, always exaggerated. He was painted red, wielding his genitals like a weapon. And he wasn't meant to be hidden. He was protection. He scared away evil, touched for luck, worshipped for fertility. In Roman homes, no doorway was complete without a symbol of virility. Soldiers carried tiny metal penises into battle. Newborn babies wore phallic amulets to ward off bad spirits. Even priests tied symbolic genitals to their staffs during religious festivals. And these weren't crude jokes. They were sacred traditions. A soldier about to face death carried a bronze phallus to feel protected. A bride, on her wedding night, touched a stone penis for fertility. A baker carved one above his oven for prosperity. There's one bakery in Pompeii that tells the whole story. On the outside wall, a stone relief of Priapus, weighing his engorged genitals on a scale against a sack of gold. Inside, ovens shaped like penises, bread baked in molds. Above it all, another carving, to bless the loaves. It wasn't perversion. It was business. Roman markets sold mirrors with phallic handles. Wind chimes shaped like genitals dangled from balconies. Couch legs carved like testicles. Oil lamps with erotic scenes burned in dining rooms. The more explicit the object, the more likely it was meant for protection, luck, or status. And during festivals, it went even further. Once a year, during the celebration of the godly bear, Roman citizens paraded through the streets with a giant wooden penis. Not a euphemism, an actual, massive, wheeled phallus, dressed in flowers. Respectable matrons walked beside it, placing garlands around the tip. Children sang hymns praising its power. Everyone clapped, danced, and feasted. This wasn't satire. This was religion. It wasn't hidden in underground cults. It wasn't locked behind adult stores. It was Roman civilization, unashamed, unfiltered, and completely normalized. And the military embraced it with equal pride. Hadrian's Wall, the massive Roman frontier in Britain, contains reproductive carvings every few hundred meters. Soldiers believed that the display of male virility could repel enemies and protect borders. Phallic graffiti covered barracks. Some carved them into their shields. Others tattooed them onto their bodies. Victory monuments depicted conquered enemies literally dominated, bent beneath the might of Roman masculinity. Statues showed submission not with swords, but with symbols of sexual control. Rome didn't just conquer with armies. It conquered with ideology carved in stone. But as much as they worshipped the symbol, they feared the real thing when wielded by the wrong person. Phallic power was only acceptable when it served the state. When women, slaves, or foreigners expressed desire, it was punished, controlled, buried. But when Roman men displayed it, publicly, grotesquely, proudly, it was seen as civilization itself. Even in death, the symbol followed them. Tombs bore erotic images. Gravestones with protective carvings guarded the dead. Some families believed the afterlife required virility to enter paradise. They buried men with erotic statues, oils, and charms, ensuring their manhood would follow them beyond the grave. It all formed a kind of visual indoctrination. From birth, Roman children saw intimacy not as private, not as sacred, but as public, performative, and powerful. They learned to touch statues for luck, to laugh at carvings, to cheer during erotic rituals. And by the time they reached adulthood, they were desensitized, conditioned, raised in a world where nothing was hidden, but everything was controlled. When Christianity eventually became the dominant religion, the reaction was swift. Armies were dispatched across the empire, not to fight enemies, but to chisel away the symbols. Millions of phallic images were scraped off walls, crushed under boots, buried under churches. It was the greatest erasure of sexual imagery in human history. But not everything was destroyed. Fragments remained, in ruined villas, on temple floors, in museum basements. A shattered statue, a burned carving, a half-scraped relief on a garden wall, evidence of a civilization that saw the penis not as taboo, but as compass, god, weapon, and ruler. And yet, the influence never fully vanished. Today, when we laugh at phallic architecture, or giggle at a suggestive fountain, we're echoing a culture that lived among thousands of them. We inherited the symbols without understanding their origin, because for Rome, it was never just about desire. It was about power. Who had it? Who didn't? And every street corner told you the answer. Rome didn't just indulge in the obscene. It legislated it, wrote it into stone, made desire something you could be taxed for, arrested over, banished for, or even killed by. While emperors built playgrounds of perversion behind closed doors, the Roman Republic and Empire built an entire legal system to police the private parts of everyone else. And they started early. By the time a girl was 12, she was considered ready for marriage. And marriage wasn't about love. It was about ownership. Her father transferred guardianship to her husband, like property changing hands. Her body wasn't hers. It was an asset, regulated, controlled, expected to produce heirs. Her pleasure, irrelevant. Her silence, expected. If she smiled too much, suspicion followed. If she didn't conceive fast enough, she was considered defective. Her movements were monitored, her clothing scrutinized, her purity taxed. Literally. In some provinces, families had to pay special tributes to marry off a virgin. The state profited from innocence. But even more disturbing was what happened if she stepped out of line. Rome had a legal category of crime called stuprum. It didn't require proof of violence. It didn't even require the woman's consent. All it required was that a woman of noble status had been touched, seen, or rumored to be intimate with someone considered improper. Improper could mean a foreigner, a slave, a lower-class man, or even just the wrong Roman man. She could be accused of stuprum by her father, her husband, or any male relative. No evidence was needed, just accusation. Once accused, the punishment wasn't a fine. It was exile, disownment, public shaming. Some women were paraded through the streets with signs hung around their necks describing their supposed crime. Others were sealed inside rooms and left to die of starvation, because execution was too merciful. Rome wanted them to suffer. And men, they faced a different set of laws altogether. A Roman male citizen could legally engage in sex with slaves, prostitutes, and even young boys, as long as he was the dominant partner. The law wasn't concerned with consent. It was concerned with power dynamics. If a man allowed himself to be penetrated, physically or metaphorically, he was mocked, penalized, even stripped of citizenship, not because of what he did, but because of how he did it. Power defined legality. Dominate, and you were a citizen. Submit, and you were scum. This led to horrific consequences. Slave owners were legally allowed to use their slaves for any kind of sexual activity. No age restriction. No limits. If a slave resisted, they could be whipped, branded, or even killed, and the owner could claim property damage. Human lives reduced to objects, tools for pleasure. No legal recourse. No witnesses allowed. And yet, Rome still wanted control over even these interactions. Brothels were taxed. Sexual services were registered. Names of sex workers were entered into public logs, etched onto walls, kept in scrolls by clerks. There are preserved documents today listing dozens of women. Name, price, specialty. Like a menu. This system wasn't chaotic. It was bureaucratic. You could apply for a license to operate a brothel. You had to meet cleanliness standards, report earnings, submit bribes to officials. There were inspectors, reviews, penalties for non-compliance. Rome turned prostitution into government-regulated commerce. Even the positions people used were recorded. Graffiti on brothel walls included diagrams, numbers, prices. Position 4, 2 denarii. Position 9, 4 denarii, includes music. Some offered group discounts. Others boasted no waiting. The walls became advertisements, and the law supported it all. The Emperor Augustus, hailed as a moral reformer, passed laws that punished adultery while promoting reproduction. Married couples were given tax breaks for having children. Bachelors were fined. Widows were required to remarry within 2 years, or face penalties. If a woman refused to marry, she could be denied inheritance. Her freedom wasn't a choice. It was a legal loophole waiting to be closed. Rome even created public morals courts, special tribunals where citizens could report neighbors for behavior considered inappropriate. Wearing makeup, suspicious. Too many parties, reportable. Public affection, grounds for formal complaint. The accused could be dragged into court, questioned and sentenced, all without having broken any actual law, just breaking the illusion of Roman virtue. And that illusion was everything, because as much as Rome indulged behind closed doors, it needed the world to see it as a moral empire, clean, disciplined, structured. So they buried the rot beneath a mountain of laws. Paper over blood. Statutes over screams. One of the most chilling examples of legal hypocrisy was how Rome handled sexual violence. If a man raped a slave, no punishment. If he raped a free woman but married her afterward, the charge was dropped. If he raped another man's wife, he could be punished, but only if the husband filed a formal complaint. If he chose to stay silent, the law stayed silent too. There are records of senators arranging bribes between families to prevent rape charges from becoming public scandals, not to protect the victim, but to preserve the family name. honor was more valuable than justice, and desire was only legal when it reinforced power. Rome built roads, aqueducts, armies, but it also built a legal code that taught people how to suppress their humanity while rewarding those who weaponized it. It made pleasure into policy, trauma into tax revenue, and control into civilization. But if you think this legal darkness was the end of Rome's story, it wasn't. Because when everything began to crumble, when the empire started to fall, the final Roman sexual obsession emerged. Not domination, not purity, but transformation. As the empire began to crack, so did the minds of the people within it. The Rome that once defined itself through dominance, structure, and law started dissolving into something else, something more chaotic, more confused, and somehow even darker. With borders falling, economies crashing, and faith in the gods collapsing, Roman sexuality underwent a final mutation. No longer about power, no longer about purity. Now, it became about transformation. The line between man and woman blurred, between pleasure and pain, between body and spirit. Rome began to unravel itself from the inside out. It started in the cults. In the shadow of the grand temples and fading gods, underground religions emerged. Mystery cults, secret societies, imported rituals from Persia, Egypt, and the East. Many of them promised transcendence through the body, not through denial, but through change. One of the most extreme was the cult of Cybele, a mother goddess imported from Anatolia. Her priests were called the Golli, and they were born men, but they didn't stay that way. Initiation into the priesthood required a public ritual, self-castration. During the annual festival, men would dance wildly in the streets, intoxicated by music, wine, and madness. At the height of the frenzy, they would take a sharpened blade and sever their own genitals in front of the crowd. Their screams were drowned out by drums and flutes. Blood ran down the steps of the temples. They then dressed as women, took on feminine names, and lived as priestesses for the rest of their lives. This wasn't isolated. It was revered. The more pain they endured, the more divine they were believed to become. Roman elites would seek blessings from the Golli, believing their sacrifice gave them access to powers beyond mortal understanding. Some emperors even protected them under special laws. But not all Romans accepted them. To some, the Golli were terrifying, walking symbols of everything Rome tried to control: gender, pain, religion, and rebellion. To others, they were fascinating, a living rejection of what Rome claimed was natural. They weren't seen as men or women, but something in between, something sacred, something dangerous. And they weren't alone. In the final centuries of the empire, more and more Romans began rejecting traditional roles. Wealthy men dressed as women in public. Women shaved their heads, wore armor, claimed masculine titles. Some households adopted communal living where gender roles were fluid, relationships rotated, and parenting was shared. Rome, for centuries obsessed with strict boundaries, was now collapsing those very walls. The old rules no longer mattered. Marriage was no longer expected. Virginity was no longer sacred. Even clothing changed. Robes became ambiguous. Cosmetics were used by all. Statues became androgynous. Even the gods started changing. Statues of Venus were carved with both breasts and beards. Hermaphroditus, part male, part female, became a popular deity of beauty and duality. In private gardens, wealthy families commissioned sculptures that depicted figures with mixed anatomy, posed in ways that defied categorization. These weren't jokes. They were devotions. It was as if Rome, knowing its end was near, had stopped trying to dominate the world and started trying to feel something, anything new, to transform, to escape, to reinvent the body before it turned to dust. Emperor Elagabalus embodied this completely. He was crowned at 14. By 15, he insisted on being addressed as a woman. He wore makeup, jewelry, and silk gowns in court. He married multiple men, publicly. He even offered vast sums of money to any doctor who could surgically give him a vagina, not as a disguise, as his truth. The empire was horrified. Senators wrote letters begging for him to be stopped. Soldiers muttered about omens and divine punishment. But Elagabalus didn't care. He believed the gods had chosen him to transcend human roles, that his body wasn't just political, it was sacred. He built temples with open roofs, so sunlight could touch him directly. He hosted rituals where he danced naked under the stars, painted in gold, declaring himself both husband and wife to the sun. He believed that only by destroying all categories, of gender, of power, of law, could he become truly divine. It couldn't last. By age 18, Elagabalus was assassinated, his body dragged through the streets, his name erased from the records. The Senate declared his memory damnatio memoriae, a punishment worse than death. His identity was forbidden, his statues destroyed, his legacy turned to dust. But the chaos he unleashed didn't die with him. The empire fell soon after, not just because of politics or economics, but because it had exhausted itself. It had burned through every boundary, broken every rule, tested every limit, and found nothing left. Rome had dominated the world, then dominated itself, then tried to become something else entirely, and in the end, all it left behind were ruins. Walls that once echoed with moans, laughter, and screams now stand silent. Statues without names, baths without warmth, and in the soil, carvings, graffiti, bones, whispers of a civilization that pushed sex further than any society before or since. Not for love, not for connection, but for power, control, and finally, desperation. When we think of Rome, we think of marble columns, disciplined soldiers, mighty emperors, and grand arenas. We rarely think of children trained for sex, of laws designed to punish purity, of streets carved with genitals, of gods who demanded blood not for faith, but for arousal. But that was Rome. It didn't separate pleasure from power. It fused them, weaponized them, buried them in temples and tax codes and marriage contracts. Intimacy wasn't a private act. It was a public ritual, a performance, a tool of the state. And the deeper you go, the more you realize Rome didn't just build an empire with violence. It built it with desire. Desire engineered, managed, standardized. It built sex schools. It built law courts for rumors. It created job titles for human instruction manuals. It minted coins with erotic scenes, recorded bedroom champions in stone, paid bonuses to gladiators for how many noblewomen they pleased, trained priests to bleed in the streets, raised statues not for gods, but for erections. And yet, amid all of it, there was pain, deep, silent, generational pain. Behind every brothel wall was a girl sold by her father. Behind every training performance was a child whose bones were bent into compliance. Behind every marriage contract was a woman who never got to say no. And behind every law about public decency was a hypocrisy so thick it suffocated. Rome made people disappear. It erased the voices of those who couldn't fight back. It called them impure, immoral, unworthy, and when they cried out, it buried them under monuments, under graffiti, under the roar of cheering crowds. Because in Rome, pleasure wasn't personal. It was political. And when you make pleasure political, you turn human bodies into tools, into objects, into stages for power games. You stop asking if people are willing. You stop caring. You write laws that define morality not by kindness or empathy, but by control. You make sex sacred, but only for the rich. You make virginity valuable, but only when it benefits a man. You make identity flexible, but only when it doesn't threaten the system. And when someone tries to break those rules, from a Vestal virgin who falls in love to an emperor who wants to be a woman, the machine crushes them. Because no matter how perverse Rome became, its core never changed. It was always about power. Even the gods were reflections of it. Gods who demanded offerings not of love or hope, but of obedience. Gods who turned blood into blessings. Who watched from temple walls as people were broken in their name. And yet, we still look at Rome with awe. We visit the ruins. We study the architecture. We quote the philosophers. We recreate the battles. But we forget the people who didn't get to leave a record. The women, the slaves, the children, the performers, the forgotten. Their stories were scratched out, their names lost, their bodies discarded, and still, in the shadows of those silent stones, their truth lingers. Because Rome was never just a city. It was a mirror. It showed the world what happens when desire is no longer about connection, but about dominance. When bodies become currency. When love becomes law. When pain becomes entertainment. When silence becomes policy. And maybe that's why people still find themselves drawn to it. Not because we admire what Rome did, but because we recognize it. We see echoes of it in the present, in the systems that reward power and punish vulnerability, in cultures that sexualize before they empathize, in industries that sell performance over truth, in laws that still try to control what people do with their bodies, and who they do it with. Rome isn't gone. It's still with us, in the architecture of control, in the rituals of silence, in the stories we refuse to tell, and in the questions we're still too afraid to ask. Because if Rome, with all its glory, genius, and greatness, could collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, what does that say about us? Not just what we build, but what we celebrate. Not just what we condemn, but what we tolerate. In the end, the Roman Empire didn't fall because it was wild. It fell because it lost the ability to feel anything real. It replaced meaning with performance, intimacy with spectacle, connection with conquest. And that's not history. That's a warning.